The high-pitched whir of surveillance rotors 200 feet above my backyard meant one thing. Someone had convinced federal agents that I was a national security threat. 4 police drones were maintaining perfect formation in a surveillance pattern I'd personally designed for the FBI Counterintelligence Division. The irony would have been hilarious if it wasn't terrifying. My name is Blake Anderson, and for the past 8 years, I've been teaching federal agencies how to use aerial surveillance to catch actual threats to national security. But Carol Winters, my HOA security coordinator neighbor, had just weaponized my own surveillance training against me by reporting my pool demolition drone footage as enemy reconnaissance operations. What Carol didn't know was that every surveillance protocol she'd triggered, every federal response circling overhead, every counterintelligence procedure now being deployed against me, I had personally trained the agents implementing them. And in 6 hours, when those same agents realized they were surveilling their own instructor, someone was going to have to explain how a former NSA analyst had convinced the FBI that America's drone surveillance trainer was actually a foreign spy. We've all seen those mysterious drones flying overhead and wondered what they're really doing up there. Right? Those moments when you can't tell if it's someone's hobby or something more serious? As this story unfolds, you'll probably start noticing the drones in your own neighborhood and questioning who's really watching whom. What happened next will make you reconsider everything you think you know about aerial surveillance. 2 months ago, I made the decision to convert my backyard pool into a drone testing facility for my search and rescue training programs. Working as an FAA-certified drone instructor requires controlled environments where emergency responders can practice aerial coordination without interfering with civilian air traffic or compromising ongoing operations. The pool had been installed by the previous homeowner, but for someone who spends his days teaching police departments and fire departments how to use unmanned aircraft for emergency response, it represented prime real estate for creating a professional training environment. My current assignment involved developing standardized protocols for multi-agency drone coordination during natural disaster response. I obtained proper demolition permits and began the process of removing the pool structure while using my professional drone equipment to document each phase of the project. The aerial documentation served dual purposes: creating a time-lapse record of the demolition process and testing new camera stabilization systems that would improve emergency response footage quality. That's when Carol Winters entered my life like a stealth surveillance drone that had been programmed to identify threats where none existed. She appeared at my fence line on the first morning I deployed my aerial documentation system, carrying what appeared to be professional counter-surveillance equipment and wearing the expression of someone who'd spent years looking over her shoulder for threats that might or might not be there. Mr. Anderson, I'm Carol Winters, HOA Security Coordinator and Community Threat Assessment Specialist, she announced, positioning sophisticated scanning equipment to monitor my drone operations. I've received preliminary reports about unauthorized aerial surveillance activities that may constitute security violations. Carol had the bearing of someone with extensive intelligence background, referencing specific federal regulations and surveillance protocols with the precision of someone who'd been trained in reconnaissance countermeasures. What struck me as immediately concerning was her unusually detailed knowledge of surveillance countermeasures that most civilians wouldn't possess. I understand your concerns about aerial activities, I replied, but I'm an FAA-certified drone instructor conducting legitimate documentation of permitted construction work. She consulted her scanning equipment and frowned with practiced authority. Mr. Anderson, unauthorized surveillance operations in residential areas require federal oversight regardless of claimed construction purposes. Aerial reconnaissance capabilities pose significant security risks to community members. I examined her equipment, noting that her surveillance detection gear included signal analyzers and radio frequency monitors that suggested professional-level paranoia about being watched. Either she'd invested heavily in commercial counter-surveillance technology, or she'd been trained to detect aerial monitoring by someone with intelligence community expertise. Carol, I'm curious about your background in surveillance detection. Your equipment and terminology suggest experience beyond typical neighborhood security coordination. Her confident expression flickered with something I'd learned to recognize during search and rescue operations, where missing persons had fled from situations they couldn't explain to people they couldn't trust. Community security requires comprehensive understanding of all potential surveillance threats. She deflected, I maintain professional relationships with appropriate federal authorities to ensure neighborhood protection from aerial reconnaissance. But professional relationships don't typically provide access to the sophisticated counter-surveillance equipment and detection protocols that Carol was demonstrating. My drone training had taught me to recognize when someone's defensive posture came from genuine threat assessment rather than general paranoia. Over the next week, Carol's surveillance detection campaign escalated with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood exactly what evidence would convince authorities that a legitimate aerial threat existed. She documented my flight patterns, photographed my equipment configurations, and filed reports that contained precise technical specifications about surveillance capabilities and privacy violations. Each report included accurate descriptions of drone technology, proper terminology for aerial surveillance classification, and detailed security concerns that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how aerial monitoring operations are conducted. Someone had taught Carol to recognize and document surveillance activities with professional-level expertise. The pattern triggered my professional instincts in ways that had nothing to do with neighborhood disputes and everything to do with understanding how people develop specific knowledge about surveillance countermeasures. I decided to apply the same investigative methodology I used for search and rescue missions to understand exactly who I was dealing with and why her knowledge of surveillance detection was so comprehensive. Using professional networks and public records databases, I began building a background profile of Carol Winter's history and potential connections to intelligence community training. What I discovered explained everything about her reaction to my drone operations and challenged every assumption I'd made about her motivations. Carol Winters had been a surveillance analyst with the National Security Agency for 15 years before taking early retirement 3 years ago, following what personnel records diplomatically described as a psychological evaluation and medical leave. Her specialty had been foreign intelligence threat assessment, with particular expertise in detecting hostile surveillance operations against American intelligence personnel. The record showed that Carol had been personally targeted by foreign intelligence services for over 3 years, subjected to sophisticated surveillance operations designed to compromise her work and potentially recruit her as a double agent. Her early retirement had been precipitated by what agency psychologists had classified as surveillance-induced paranoia and hypervigilance. Carol's comprehensive knowledge of surveillance detection hadn't come from community security training. It had come from being professionally hunted by foreign intelligence operatives who'd used the same aerial monitoring and electronic surveillance techniques that my drone operations superficially resembled, but it had also come from spending 15 years hunting those same foreign operatives as part of her NSA counterintelligence work. The revelation hit me like discovering that your security coordinator isn't paranoid, but a former intelligence professional who's been programmed to see surveillance threats everywhere because they'd spent years being genuinely surveilled by hostile foreign agents. I immediately understood why Carol's reaction to my drone activities had been so intense and technically sophisticated. She wasn't seeing a neighbor conducting legitimate aerial documentation. She was seeing the same surveillance patterns that foreign intelligence services had used to track and monitor her during her NSA career. Every flight path I programmed reminded her of the aerial surveillance that had made her life a nightmare for 3 years. Every camera angle I captured looked identical to the reconnaissance operations that had forced her into early retirement from a career she'd dedicated her life to protecting national security. My professional drone work was triggering memories of the surveillance operations that had destroyed her career and psychological well-being. The psychological impact was staggering. Carol wasn't filing security reports because she was controlling or paranoid. She was filing them because she'd been trained by the NSA to recognize aerial surveillance patterns. And she was genuinely terrified that the same foreign intelligence operations that had targeted her might be targeting our community. I called Dr. Robert Chen, an intelligence community therapist I'd worked with during joint federal training exercises, to understand how former intelligence personnel process surveillance trauma. Blake. Intelligence analysts who've been personally targeted develop hypervigilance about surveillance that can persist for years after retirement. Dr. Chen explained, when NSA personnel are subjected to hostile foreign surveillance, they often experience ongoing anxiety about being watched that affects their civilian lives. Robert, I'm dealing with someone whose NSA career was ended by foreign surveillance operations, and she's interpreting my legitimate drone work as a potential intelligence threat. Blake, that's textbook intelligence community PTSD. She's not being malicious. She's trying to protect your community from the surveillance operations that destroyed her career. Her technical knowledge makes her believe she can identify and prevent foreign intelligence targeting. Dr. Chen's explanation crystallized what my professional empathy should have recognized immediately. Carol's security enforcement actions weren't about controlling neighborhood activities. They were about protecting our community from the surveillance threats that had forced her out of intelligence work. But understanding Carol's trauma didn't change the fact that her security reports were becoming increasingly sophisticated and technically detailed. She'd begun filing formal complaints with federal authorities, using the legitimate threat reporting protocols that intelligence community personnel learn for identifying potential foreign surveillance operations. Her latest report to the FBI's Counterintelligence Division contained detailed analysis of my drone flight patterns, technical specifications of my equipment, and comprehensive threat assessment that made my legitimate professional activities appear suspicious to investigators who didn't understand the context. The irony was devastating. Carol was using the same analytical skills and technical expertise that had made her valuable to the NSA to protect our community from surveillance threats. But she was applying that intelligence training to someone whose mission was teaching responsible surveillance ethics to law enforcement. I faced a choice that had no clear precedent in either drone operations protocols or intelligence community trauma counseling. I could continue my aerial documentation and trigger someone who'd been professionally hunted by foreign agents. Or I could find a way to help Carol understand that my work represented protection rather than surveillance. The decision was made for me when Carol's latest federal report triggered an automatic counterintelligence investigation protocol that would bring armed federal agents and police surveillance drones to our quiet suburban neighborhood. Her final security assessment had contained enough technical accuracy and intelligence community credibility to convince federal investigators that a potential foreign surveillance operation existed in our community. She'd followed the exact protocols that NSA personnel learn for reporting suspicious aerial activities, and those protocols were designed to trigger immediate federal response. That's when I realized Carol's trauma-driven security campaign had accidentally created the very surveillance situation she'd been trying to prevent. Her reports would bring federal surveillance assets to our neighborhood, creating exactly the kind of aerial monitoring environment that had traumatized her during her intelligence career. But what Carol didn't understand was that her NSA background and technical expertise had made her the most credible witness federal investigators could encounter when evaluating surveillance threats. Every detail she'd documented matched the analysis patterns that counterintelligence teams use to identify legitimate foreign operations. The woman who'd been trying to protect our neighborhood from surveillance threats was about to trigger a federal response that would put every resident under aerial monitoring, and the only person who could prevent that escalation was the drone instructor she'd been reporting as a surveillance threat. Tomorrow morning, her final assessment would reach federal investigators who specialized in foreign surveillance threats, and unless I could find a way to help Carol understand that we were both trying to protect people from the same surveillance dangers that had destroyed her NSA career, our quiet suburban community was about to become the center of a counterintelligence investigation that would bring the exact aerial surveillance that had traumatized her in the first place. The federal response came exactly as I'd trained them to implement it. At 6:23 a.m., I watched through my kitchen window as unmarked vehicles established perimeter control, while electronic surveillance units positioned themselves for comprehensive aerial monitoring. FBI Counterintelligence Division protocols were being executed with textbook precision against the person who'd written half the surveillance procedures they were following. Agent Sarah Mitchell from the Counterintelligence Division called my cell phone as the fourth police drone locked into formation overhead. "Mr. Anderson, this is Agent Mitchell with FBI Counterintelligence. We need you to step outside your residence and comply with federal surveillance protocols for a potential national security investigation." I recognized Sarah's voice immediately. She'd been in my advanced aerial surveillance course 18 months ago, where I'd taught her the exact drone coordination patterns now being deployed above my house. The professional irony was staggering, but the federal implications were deadly serious. "Agent Mitchell, this is Blake Anderson, your former FAA surveillance instructor," I said as I stepped onto my front porch with my hands clearly visible. "I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding about the nature of my aerial activities." The pause that followed was pregnant with recognition and confusion. "Blake? What the hell? You're the surveillance threat we're investigating?" "Captain Lisa Torres, commanding the police drone unit." A approached with the tactical precision of someone implementing federal surveillance protocols under direct FBI oversight. Her expression shifted from professional alertness to bewildered recognition as she processed that she was surveilling her own instructor, Blake. We received detailed intelligence assessments about sophisticated aerial surveillance operations conducted by someone with apparent counterintelligence training. Captain Torres explained, "The reporting was so technically accurate that federal analysts classified this as a potential foreign intelligence operation." I gestured toward the drones maintaining perfect surveillance formation overhead. "Lisa, you're using formation pattern Delta 7, modified for residential counter-surveillance. I taught you that pattern during the Minneapolis joint training exercise." "Jesus Christ," she muttered, realizing the absurdity of surveilling the person who'd designed their surveillance protocols. "Blake, whoever filed these reports has NSA-level knowledge of surveillance operations. The threat assessment was professional enough to convince federal counterintelligence that we had a legitimate foreign operation." That's when I saw Carol watching from her living room window, her face showing the complex mixture of vindication and growing horror of someone who'd successfully triggered the exact federal surveillance response she'd been trying to prevent. Her intelligence training had worked too well, creating the aerial monitoring environment that had traumatized her during her NSA career. Agent Mitchell reviewed her case files while the surveillance drones maintained their pattern overhead. "Blake, these reports were filed by Carol Winters, former NSA surveillance analyst with 15 years of counterintelligence experience. Her assessments contained technical accuracy that made federal response mandatory." "Sarah, I need to explain something about Mrs. Winters that might clarify why her reports were so credible. She's not filing false threat assessments. She's applying legitimate NSA training to civilian surveillance activities because of professional trauma." The conversation that followed required delicate handling of classified information and personal psychology that transcended normal federal investigation protocols. Agent Mitchell needed to understand that Carol's surveillance reports came from genuine expertise combined with intelligence community trauma that made her see foreign threats in civilian activities. "Blake, are you telling me that our surveillance target is actually a traumatized intelligence analyst who reported you because she thought you were conducting the same operations that ended her NSA career?" "Sarah, Carol Winters was personally targeted by foreign intelligence services for 3 years. Her early retirement was precipitated by surveillance-induced psychological trauma. My aerial documentation triggered memories of the surveillance operations that destroyed her career." Agent Mitchell called for a tactical stand-down while she reviewed Carol's personnel files and psychological evaluation records. The federal investigation had uncovered not a foreign surveillance operation, but a tragic case of intelligence community trauma being channeled into community overprotection. 30 minutes later, Agent Mitchell approached Carol's front door with the professional empathy of an investigator who understood the difference between malicious threat reporting and trauma-driven overprotection. I accompanied her to help explain the technical aspects of my drone operations and how they differed from the surveillance methods that had traumatized Carol. "Mrs. Winters, I'm Agent Mitchell with FBI Counterintelligence. We need to discuss the surveillance threat reports you filed regarding Mr. Anderson's aerial activities." Carol opened her door with the resigned expression of someone who'd known this moment would eventually come. "Agent Mitchell, I documented legitimate surveillance threats using proper NSA reporting protocols. My assessments were technically accurate and followed established counterintelligence procedures." "Mrs. Winters, your reports demonstrate sophisticated understanding of surveillance operations that prompted appropriate federal response. However, we need to clarify the nature of Mr. Anderson's aerial activities and how they relate to your professional background." That's when I stepped forward to bridge the gap between Carol's intelligence expertise and my drone operations. "Carol, I want to show you exactly what my surveillance equipment is designed to do, and how it differs from the foreign intelligence operations that targeted you during your NSA career." The demonstration that followed became an impromptu masterclass in surveillance ethics that helped Carol understand how my equipment was designed to protect people rather than spy on them. I started by explaining the fundamental differences between aerial documentation and intelligence gathering, between civilian drone operations and foreign surveillance activities. Using my professional equipment, I demonstrated how search and rescue drones are programmed to locate missing persons rather than monitor civilian activities. I showed her how emergency response aerial coordination helps first responders save lives rather than collecting intelligence on American citizens. Carol, every flight pattern you documented serves a protective function, I explained. We don't conduct surveillance to gather intelligence. We use aerial technology to coordinate emergency response and save lives during disasters. I demonstrated how my equipment was configured for documentation rather than reconnaissance, how the camera systems were optimized for construction oversight rather than intelligence collection, and how every safety protocol was designed to minimize privacy intrusion while maximizing operational effectiveness. Carol's technical questions revealed the depth of knowledge her NSA career had provided about surveillance operations. She understood the differences between foreign intelligence collection and domestic emergency response, but her trauma had caused her to interpret my legitimate activities as potential threats. Blake, I spent 15 years hunting foreign operatives who used these same technologies against American intelligence personnel, she said, tears flowing as she realized how her expertise had been twisted by trauma into seeing threats where protection existed. When I saw your aerial operations, I thought you might be conducting the same surveillance that destroyed my career. The emotional breakthrough was therapeutic for Carol and educational for the federal agents witnessing the intersection of intelligence community, trauma, and civilian misunderstanding. Agent Mitchell recognized that Carol's reports hadn't been false or malicious, but had represented legitimate application of NSA training to perceived threats. Mrs. Winters, your surveillance threat assessments were professionally accurate and appropriately reported, Agent Mitchell said. The federal response was justified based on your intelligence community credentials and technical expertise. However, we need to help you distinguish between actual foreign threats and legitimate civilian operations. Dr. Robert Chen arrived within 2 hours, called in to provide specialized counseling for intelligence community personnel dealing with surveillance trauma. His presence helped Carol begin processing how her NSA training could be channeled into community protection rather than threat overreaction. Carol, your knowledge of surveillance operations is an asset to your community, Dr. Chen explained, but that knowledge needs to be applied through healing rather than hypervigilance, through education rather than enforcement. The community meeting that afternoon was unlike anything our neighborhood had ever experienced. Federal agents explained how legitimate intelligence community expertise could trigger appropriate law enforcement responses, while surveillance specialists described the difference between foreign intelligence operations and civilian claws. Technology use. The gathering drew unprecedented attendance from across our suburb, with families who'd watched the morning's federal surveillance response seeking answers about what had happened and why their neighborhood had been treated as a potential national security threat. Children who'd seen police drones overhead needed reassurance that their community was safe. Carol spoke to assembled residents about her NSA career and how being targeted by foreign surveillance had shaped her perception of aerial monitoring. I thought I was protecting you from the same surveillance operations that ended my intelligence career. I didn't understand that Blake is using technology to save lives, not gather intelligence on American citizens. Her presentation included declassified information about how foreign intelligence services target American communities, explanation of why former intelligence personnel develop hypervigilance about surveillance, and details about how legitimate security concerns could be distinguished from trauma-driven overreaction. Tom Rivera, our elderly neighbor who'd been concerned about drone surveillance, stood up during the discussion period. Carol, we appreciate your expertise and your concern for our security, but this morning's federal response was terrifying for families who thought our neighborhood was under investigation. The conversation that followed was delicate but necessary. Residents needed to process their own trauma from the federal surveillance response while supporting Carol's healing journey and understanding the legitimate security expertise that had triggered the investigation. Agent Mitchell facilitated discussions about balancing community security awareness with support for neighbors dealing with intelligence community trauma. Mrs. Winters' knowledge of surveillance operations is valuable to your community, but it needs to be channeled through cooperation rather than enforcement, through education rather than investigation. 6 months later, Carol and I had developed the most comprehensive community surveillance awareness program in our region. She used her NSA expertise to educate residents about legitimate security concerns, while I provided technical training about civilian drone operations and privacy protection. The program became a model for integrating intelligence community expertise into civilian security education Carol's understanding of foreign surveillance methods, combined with her experience processing trauma, and made her uniquely qualified to help other communities distinguish between actual threats and perceived dangers. Our monthly security workshops attracted federal agents, intelligence community, retirees, and technology professionals who needed to understand the intersection of surveillance awareness and community protection. Carol's presentations about recognizing legitimate threats versus trauma responses became required training for FBI community liaison programs. The difference between protective awareness and paralyzing paranoia is education. Carol explained during a federal law enforcement conference. Understanding the technical reality of surveillance operations helps intelligence community personnel contribute to genuine security while processing career-related trauma. Her work expanded beyond our neighborhood to include consulting with other communities where intelligence community retirees struggled to balance security awareness with civilian privacy rights. The Carol Winters Intelligence Community Integration Initiative provided training for local law enforcement, community organizations, and intelligence family support networks. Agent Mitchell credited our case with improving federal protocols for evaluating surveillance threat reports from intelligence community personnel. The Anderson-Winters case taught us that technical accuracy in threat reporting doesn't always indicate malicious activity. Intelligence community trauma can create legitimate security concerns that require therapeutic intervention rather than enforcement response. Federal training now includes modules on recognizing trauma-informed threat reporting and distinguishing between actual foreign operations and civilian activities interpreted through intelligence community experience. Our case study became required reading for counterintelligence analysts who evaluate surveillance threat assessments. The surveillance drones that had circled my property were reassigned to actual foreign intelligence monitoring, while the federal investigation protocols were updated to include psychological evaluation of intelligence community reporters who demonstrate hypervigilance about civilian surveillance activities. 2 years after the police drone response, Carol received recognition from the Director of National Intelligence for developing trauma-informed community security programs that helped former intelligence personnel contribute to civilian protection while processing career-related psychological challenges. Your transformation of intelligence community expertise into civilian security education represents the highest values of public service. The D&I citation read, "You've honored your NSA career by preventing communities from experiencing unnecessary surveillance anxiety while contributing to legitimate security awareness." The recognition ceremony became a celebration of intelligence community healing that honored both Carol's NSA service and her civilian recovery journey. Federal agents from across the intelligence community attended to witness how professional surveillance expertise could be channeled into community protection. Distinguished attendees included former CIA analysts, NSA, surveillance specialists, and FBI counterintelligence officers who had struggled with similar transitions from classified work to civilian life. Many had experienced their own challenges integrating intelligence community expertise with neighborhood relationships, making Carol's transformation particularly meaningful to the broader intelligence community. "I spent 15 years protecting America from foreign surveillance threats," Carol said during her acceptance speech. "Learning to distinguish between actual threats and trauma-driven fears allowed me to continue that mission in civilian life." The ceremony included presentations from communities that had benefited from Carol's security programs, federal agents who'd learned from our case study, and intelligence community personnel who recognized the unique challenges faced by analysts dealing with surveillance-related trauma. Captain Torres, who'd led the original drone surveillance operation, spoke about how the investigation had changed federal protocols for evaluating aerial threat reports. Mrs. Winters' case taught us that the most credible surveillance assessments sometimes come from people who understand foreign intelligence operations best, even when their understanding is shaped by personal experience. But the most meaningful recognition came from families in our community who'd learned to balance realistic security awareness with support for neighbors dealing with intelligence community trauma. Our neighborhood had become a model for communities seeking to integrate federal expertise while maintaining civilian privacy rights. My pool removal project had become a drone testing facility where Carol and I conducted surveillance awareness demonstrations for federal agencies, intelligence community retirees, and civilian organizations. The aerial documentation techniques that had triggered her initial fear became teaching tools for understanding how surveillance technology could be used ethically and protectively. The federal investigation results were used to develop training protocols for distinguishing between foreign intelligence operations and civilian technology use interpreted through intelligence community trauma. Agent Mitchell established ongoing consultation relationships with both Carol and me, recognizing that community-based surveillance expertise could enhance federal capabilities while preventing unnecessary investigations. Standing in my completed drone testing facility, surrounded by equipment that Carol now recognized as tools for protecting rather than surveilling our community, I realized that sometimes the most sophisticated surveillance operations are the ones that happen inside people's minds when they're trying to protect others from experiencing the trauma they've endured. Carol Winters had thought she was reporting a foreign surveillance threat because she'd been trained by the NSA to recognize aerial intelligence operations. But she'd actually been protecting our community the same way she'd protected national security during her intelligence career, by identifying potential dangers and taking action to neutralize them. The difference was learning to distinguish between creating security and creating anxiety. And sometimes, it takes a federal surveillance response to teach a neighborhood that the most dangerous operations are the ones that happen when intelligence community expertise meets civilian misunderstanding without proper therapeutic support. The drone testing facility continues serving its original purpose, training law enforcement officers to use aerial surveillance ethically and effectively. But it also serves a new purpose Carol helped create, teaching communities how intelligence expertise can be transformed into protection, how surveillance knowledge can become security education, and how even the most sophisticated misunderstandings can be resolved with professional competence and therapeutic intervention. The surveillance drones have been reassigned to actual threats, but the surveillance awareness continues, protecting families from both foreign intelligence operations and the anxiety that comes from not understanding the difference between protection and invasion, between security and surveillance, between watching over people and watching people,